Welcome to Funding a Better Future, Episode 1, Past, Present and Future. So, how has funding been affected by historic austerity measures, and is the government doing anything about it? Local authorities have always borrowed for a variety of purposes. Historically, councils have tended to rely on direct borrowing from banks and subsidised loans from the state through the Public Works Loans Board. The PWLB, as it's called, has always been attractive because it's relatively easy to obtain the funding and the interest rates are low. In the 1990s, the Private Finance Initiative provided an extra string to this bow, providing a new approach to funding projects such as schools, for example, by using private funds to bridge the gap between public sector aspiration and the availability of public resources. PFI have in recent years fallen out of favour on account, for amongst other reasons, because of their poor value for money. In parallel, in the noughties and in the teens, local authorities were given more freedom to decide what and how much to borrow. Through the introduction of the Prudential Borrowing Code, when direct revenue support from central government was cut, immediately following the crash in 2009, councils looked to the PWLB to fund commercial asset purchases to generate and replace the revenues that had been lost. Given the volume of transactions, the government has become alarmed at the risk this presents and begun to rein this in through changes to the PWLB.
So what are the government's plans for investing in infrastructure going forward? In summer 2020, the government provided £8.6 billion of capital investment in infrastructure, decarbonisation and maintenance projects. To support the recovery and drive economic growth following the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2020 spending review provided for a total investment of £100 billion in 2020-2021, with plans to invest more than £600 billion over the next 5 years. The National Infrastructure Strategy, which was published in November 2020, sets out how the government will support private investment infrastructure, including through setting up a new wide infrastructure bank, which will co-invest in infrastructure projects alongside private sector investors. The government wants to use infrastructure to unite and level up the UK, with towns and communities being revitalised and cities living up to their full potential. So, does the government intend to prioritise certain sectors, and if so, what are these sectors? In 2020-2021, the government intends to invest £27 billion in key economic infrastructure sectors, namely transport, energy and digital communications. Longer-term budgets for key infrastructure projects are also included in the Spending Review 2020, and these include funding for HS2, strategic roads, flood defences and broadband. Infrastructure investment is seen as fundamental to delivering net zero emissions by 2050. The government's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution sets out the focus for the energy sector to deliver net zero emissions by 2050. So what level of investment will there be in these sectors and over what period? So taking transport first, the National Infrastructure Strategy sets out investment in the order of just under £41 billion. And this is in a number of areas, including roads, buses, funding settlements for local transport, together with investment in the rail network. Turning then to digital connectivity, the National Infrastructure Strategy sets out investment of nearly £6 billion, and that will subsidise the rollout of broadband to uncommercial areas, deliver 4G across 95% of the UK from at least one operator by 2025, with investment around 5G. Then looking at the energy sector, as part of the 10-point plan that I picked up on before, there will be £12 billion of government investment.
So, is there still a role for the private sector in relation to public infrastructure works and investments? I think, first of all, we need to understand that the private sector has always been involved in public procurement works, whether that is in relation to nobles paying for cathedrals, to private industrialists paying for railways or canals. Now, obviously, the latest iteration of this, as mentioned by Nathan earlier, is the PFI and PPP structure, which has fallen out of favour in the last decade, given it was seen to skew in favour of commercial incentives, and there have obviously been some fairly high profile failures, such as the Carillion collapse. Also, with the ready availability of cheap finance from the PWLB, that's really been where local authorities and the public sector has been looking to finance things recently. But that belt is being tightened, again, as mentioned by Nathan. So local authorities are really looking at other viable sources to fund these sorts of works. And so I think the answer is yes, private sector definitely still has a role to play. The question is making sure that that role is fit for purpose for the 21st century. Now, we do have the procurement regime in place and the Prudential Code of Practice, but I think everyone agrees that there's still some work to be done in terms of balancing the interests of the private and public sectors in relation to these sorts of arrangements. So we're in a really interesting time now, and it will be good to see how this goes in the future. Thank you for listening to episode 1 of our vlog series, Funding the Future. I hope you found that brief canter through the existing public and private funding arrangements to be useful. The next episode will be all about going into these models in more depth in terms of what's available for public funding. So do join us on episode 2 when you can.